White people fear black men. That's not fair, but it's true.
There was a real fear that if you let blacks get control, everything would change. And there was no, with some people, there was no idea that there would be any fairness or any democracy or anything, you know, that there would be a decent, well-run city government, county government, whatever. It was like, if this happens, we're lost. And it was just a terrible fear.
Let's get real. There's an unspoken tension in the air. Why is it that in stores, on sidewalks, in schools, even in the workplace, white people often fear black people? Not always openly, not always consciously, but it is there. And no, this is not just about crime statistics or media stereotypes. It runs deep, much deeper. This fear is historical, psychological, and systemic. Watch and pay attention, and I will share my thought later.
That a lot of the, we'll talk about police brutality. I feel a lot of white men are scared of black men because of their lack of exposure to black men or people of color. I'm not scared of black men. I'm not scared of Latino men. I've been around them my whole life, right? But I feel a white officer might be around a black guy and he feels that emotion. He's scared of the black guy. And next thing you know, the black guy runs. He's got to shoot him because he has the power, because he can pull it out of his pants and he shoots the guy. And I feel that happens over and over and over again, that white men are just scared or intimidated by black men for no other reason than that they're the color of their skin. And it's really the ignorance and the lack of exposure to those people.
Yeah, I find that interesting that the only thing that seems to scare white people are black men. Literally, they swim with the sharks. They hunt. They go in the mountains and hike with the bears. They go to safaris and hang out with the tigers and the lions. I mean, literally, they go into the ocean and they find these indescribable ocean beings.
They jump off a 1,000-foot cliff.
They jump off of cliffs. They skydive. I mean, literally, white people do everything you can imagine that would kill them. And the one thing that only scares them is black. And that's unfortunate because our history as black people does not reflect in any way factually that we are a violent people. And I believe Minister Farrakhan said that the best when he said, we don't have a history of killing you.
When you watch the video of the black men killed by white cops in Louisiana and Minnesota, it brings us into a need for soul searching in the country. All the things Bill Clinton did and said, one of the profound things he ever said at the end of his administration was, on race, we have to get to the roots of black pain and the roots of white fear. Clinton, a white kid from the South, had seen everything. And white fear is that you walk down the street, like Barack Obama said about his white grandparents, and they're afraid because they have black men walking about 30 feet behind them. Black pain, you've been stopped for no reason while walking to the mall, or you've been asked by an usher at a basketball game to show your ticket when the 4 white friends from the office sitting next to you don't have the usher ask them for their tickets. That's black pain and white fear, and together you could see it with these cop incidents. The white cops in Minnesota and in Louisiana showed fear on their faces. In Minnesota, because the gentleman said he had a permit for a concealed carry, and when he went for his wallet, the cop shot him. And the cop was more unhinged than the African-American girlfriend, who remained calm. In Louisiana, somebody shouted he has a gun. You could see the white fear on the face of the cop as he pulled his gun out and shot him in the chest. Dick Gregory, who was an African-American comedian back in the early 60s, once said about racism in the North and South, there's racism in both places. In the South, you can get close to white people, but just don't get too big. In the North, you can get as big as you want, but just don't get too close. We still have racism in this country. We have to get to the roots of black pain and white fear, or more of these things will happen, and it'll keep happening.
White people fear black men. That's not fair, but it's true. What makes this even more unfair is that in the vast majority of cases, our fear of black men is in no way connected to our personal experience. And if that wasn't unfair enough, study after study has shown, you know this, that fear of black men doesn't even spring primarily from racism. It's deeper than that. And that's not fair to black people or white people. Most black men have experienced what some people refer to as the fearful gaze of white men and women. Then on the other side of the equation is this: the majority of African Americans in our country, They don't trust the criminal justice system, do you? I mean, you fear the police. That's not fair. Facts don't care. The white people who have all but silenced their fear of black men are the white people who have befriended black men or have been befriended by black men and their families. I've been to my share of, far right-leaning churches and churches that lean far left, and it's so much easier for those pastors. I mean, everybody pretty much agrees on everything, and everybody else, well, everybody else is just going to hell, right? It is not enough not to be a racist. It is not enough not to be a racist. Non-racist is not the goal. Being non-racist does nothing to address racism.
Rich, who again is a fairly liberal columnist, and wrote a piece, I think it was in the New York Times, right after or right before the election, where he said that, basically racism is not a problem anymore because when white folks get to know black folks, well, their biases and their fears subside. Now, number one, I'm not sure that's true. But secondly, even if it were true, the truth is, given the history of racism, spatial segregation, residential isolation, the fact that 85% of white folks live in communities with virtually no people of color around, even if he were right, it wouldn't matter because most white folks won't get that opportunity to actually form close, intimate friendships or connections with people of color. And unfortunately, if it isn't happening, the only way we get to know folks of color is via media. So maybe we see Barack Obama on television coming into our living rooms every night. And over an 18-month to 2-year period, we're able to say, yeah, I sort of like that guy. He seems really capable and really bright. Maybe I wasn't sure at first, but given 2 years, he was able to overcome, maybe my first impression. But the only other folks we're seeing in the media are either folks who are sort of superstars on the one hand or criminals on the other hand. Those are the black folks we typically see on TV. They're either like mega millionaire athletes or entertainers, or they're the folks doing a perp walk on the 6 o'clock news that the cops have just gone arrested and haven't even let them put a shirt on before cuffing them and bringing them out in front of the cameras. If the only people you see regularly are superstar millionaires and thugs, for the average person, they can't relate to either of those, right? The average person of color can't, and the average white person can't either. The superstar you're likely to envy their position, and the thug you're afraid of. And envy and fear are not particularly good human emotions upon which to base some personal connections or intimate relationships. So I think that's what we're dealing with. Barack Obama or Bill Cosby or Oprah Winfrey or a handful of people of color, we're able to get to know them, or at least we think we know them, via media. But for average everyday white folks and for average everyday black and brown folks, the ability to really get to know each other and overcome those implicit biases is a lot more rare.
White people are scared to death right now, particularly white males. They're scared to death that they are going to lose their power in the future. And they are. But if you want to get ready for the future, if you want to be treated well in the future, treat others well in the present.
There was a real fear that if you let blacks get control, everything would change. And there was with some people, there was no idea that there would be any fairness or any democracy or anything, that there would be a decent, well-run city government, county government, whatever. It was like, if this happens, we're lost. And it was just a terrible fear. Southerners are like any other group of people. I mean, there are all kinds of folks that are included. And regardless of where they stood on integration or anything else, there were a lot of really good people who made wrong decisions and not so much did wrong things as failed to do right things. And when you look back on it, try to sort it out and figure out what could have been different. I think one of the things is that people felt a sense of being powerless. Maybe people who would have been willing to go along and go further and move forward sooner wouldn't have had any notion of any way that they could impact this, or that anything that they could personally do that would be helpful. Even as now, most of us live in a society that we think is far from perfect, and yet between now and 2 weeks from now, we're probably not going to do very much to change it. Partly because we have no sense of what we could do. And in the South, it was that way. Even people who were willing to take risk and move out were just not able to visualize what kinds of things could help. Or, how would you get enough people, if everybody that was willing to go to a certain step would move at once, then it would be accomplished. But we were all scattered out there. Nobody knew who else was willing to do what or make what changes. And there was not a lot of leadership. And leadership in the churches a lot of it was really forward-thinking and helpful, and then a lot of it was people who knew what the right thing to do was, but were terrified of taking any stand that would upset the congregation. There were people in the churches who wanted to keep the peace in the local church, in the congregation, and so they didn't want to do anything that might cause any kind of dissension. Politicians, even people who knew better, who would have been willing to go further personally or to have the state move forward, were always bound by fear of not getting reelected. And so really people who knew better just stuck with racism for political reasons, is what I think. It was, but a lot of it just in average citizens was just that people didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to help. There still are a lot of strange myths floating around in the South. There were a lot of strange tales from Reconstruction. There's an awful lot of fiction that floats about, and so I have no idea what kind of weird notions people had, but mostly I think it is of losing control. There was some higher level of trust, even of dishonest or corrupt white politicians, than of a black in some position of authority over you, for people who had grown up with these myths and fears, so that it was easier to stick with somebody that you might not have even cared for was white. I know that there were people who actually became physically ill every time there was any big desegregation news. You could just count on it. If you went to their house, you knew they were going to be in bed. It really just was. This was after I was a grown woman, and it was pretty startling to me to discover that there were people that had that were bound in that way to racism. But of course there are people who are a lot worse that I didn't happen to know personally. For me, there's a lot of guilt that's involved, because growing up, if you grow up and accept things the way they are, then you have to wonder, why did you accept all of this? Why did you not question more? Or, why didn't you think about all these things that were happening? And I don't know what the answer to that is. My great-grandfather was a really good man, but he was really racist also. He, I guess, was influenced a lot by things that happened during Reconstruction. And he was never a violent person, nor was he. It wasn't something that he spent a lot of time thinking about or talking about, but his views were, I remember, mainly his never quite forgiving the Methodist Church for reuniting. There was a Southern Methodist Church for a while, and he didn't think they should have gone back in with the Northern Methodist Church. There were a lot of really good people who were and are racist, and I don't know how you explain or justify, or a lot of people wouldn't even accept the fact that you can be both, but in my belief you can. For instance, there were a lot of people who were willing to accept when Emmett Till was murdered. There were people who were willing to accept the fact that this was, I don't remember if they said it was a prank or what, but there were stories that this didn't really happen before they found the body, and there were people who were willing to accept that. The same kind of attitude was with almost everything, where there was not an immediate finding of a body. There was always this thing, this is something somebody's made up, just a lot of denial. A lot of people who didn't want to believe that this sort of thing would happen, and would refuse to accept the fact that it was happening. I think there were a lot of people who did think it would be stopped, who never thought the change would actually happen, even after it was happening. And I think if there had not been that attitude, if people had known the change was going to happen anyhow, maybe it would have been faster. Maybe the holding the line would not have been so long and painful. But I think that part of the reason that there was not more change is just that people never did accept it as the reality of the day.
Here's the truth a lot of people do not want to admit. White fear is tied to white guilt. For over 400 years, black people were enslaved, exploited, segregated, and dehumanized. The American economy built on black backs, laws written to exclude, policy designed to control. So deep down, there is a fear. What if they want payback? What if the oppressed one day became the powerful? What if the oppressed one day become the powerful? What if justice looks like revenge? That fear, that is not about black behavior. That is a reflection of a guilty conscience. White America has been taught to fear the very idea of black power. Not because it is violent, but because it is liberating. When black people organize, build, speak up, rise up, the system starts shaking. Why do you think they feared Malcolm X, Assata Shakur, the Panthers? Because black empowerment threatens white dominance. And in a country built on control, the image of black people owning land, running businesses, educating their own, protecting their communities, that is not just radical. It is terrifying to the status quo. And in a country built on control, the image of black people owning land, running businesses, educating their own, protecting their communities, that is not just radical. It is terrifying to the status quo. For decades, media has pumped out a steady stream of fear. Black men as thugs, black women as angry, black youth as dangerous. Turn on the news, crime stories with black faces. Watch a movie, gangsters, drug dealers, sidekicks. This is not by accident. It is a tool, because if you can make people afraid of blackness, you can justify injustice. Police violence, school push-out, job discrimination, fear keeps the machine running. Here is the real kicker. This fear is not about black people. It is about what whiteness has done and is afraid might be undone. It is about the lie that whiteness is safety, goodness, normal. It is about the discomfort of seeing black excellent, brilliance, resilience, and realizing the system lied, that black people never needed saving. They needed freedom. And now, that freedom is knocking louder than ever. White fear of blackness is not rooted in reality. It is rooted in power, guilt, history, and a refusal to face the truth. But here is the thing. This fear cannot be healed with silence. It has to be unlearned. It has to be confronted. Because black liberation is not white loss. It is human gain. And when we stop fearing each other, we can finally start seeing each other. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comment box below. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.